Yat my relatives. This is Mark Charles. It is about 1:40, almost 1:45 on Monday afternoon. This is April the 26th. I wanted to come online to speak for a few minutes about the designation that the Biden administration gave to the atrocities during World War II by Turkey, labeling it and calling it genocide, what was done to the Armenian people. And I want to share a few thoughts and comments about that. I've been tweeting about it some over the weekend, and so I just wanted to talk a little bit about that this afternoon as I'm sitting down to drink my second cup of coffee. But before I do, let me start, as I always do, by acknowledging that I am on Piscataway lands. I moved with my family from the Navajo Nation to Washington, D.C. almost 6 years ago. And the lands where I live now are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. They're the nation that were here long before Columbus got lost at sea, and they're still here. And I want to acknowledge the Piscataway people. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands, and to state how humbly I am to be living on their lands, on these lands today. So the title I gave this is, it's politics and theology, not historical fact, is why Joe Biden called what Turkey did genocide against the Armenian people, but is not willing to call what the US did to Native peoples as genocide. And that's rooted not in historical fact, it's rooted in his theology and in his politics. And I want to share a little bit about that. So before we can really get into that, we have to have a discussion on what is genocide. One of the reasons why the Armenian genocide is a little bit tricky to label is because the term genocide wasn't coined by Raphael Lemkin until around 1943, I believe. And so it wasn't a term used during World War I when these atrocities happened back in 1915. And so there was some... So it wasn't labeled genocide at the time, right? There were about 2 million Armenians in that area. And at the end of World War I, it was down to 400,000. So 1.5 million people were pretty much ethnically cleansed by Turkey during that period of time. And so to understand what genocide is, I looked it up at the UN's website, the UN Office of Genocide Prevention, which I'll share a link for that in the chat of this. I have a bunch of links in here. I've spent some time preparing for this, and so I have a bunch of links I'm going to share as I go through this. But the UN Office on Genocide Prevention defines genocide in the following terms. It says it's the killing members of a group. It's causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. It's imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And so these are the terms that are needed to be met to define something as genocide. Does it contain these components? And the Armenian genocide, and I can actually share with you a little bit about that. If you have not studied much about the Armenian genocide, I'm going to put a link to this in the comments as well. It's on the New York Times. It's just a short archived article, just to give you a little bit of a general idea of what happened and what was going on. Yeah, it was literally the killing of about 1.5 million Armenian people by Turkey, and during World War I. And so it seems to fit almost every definition of what would be termed or called genocide. Now Turkey denies that the intention was deliberate. And so that's one of the ways that they're saying, well, yes, these atrocities happened. They are admitting these atrocities happened, but they are denying that it was done deliberately to ethnically cleanse or remove that group of people. And so that's why they are saying it was not genocide. But I want to talk about, and I'll just state a little bit about this. I am grateful that, and I want to commend President Biden for having the courage to label what happened to the Armenian people as genocide. I think it's important to acknowledge these histories and what happened and to be honest about them. Now, that being said, I am deeply disappointed that Joe Biden, or the US government for that matter, has not acknowledged what was done to Native Americans here in North America was genocide as well. And that's what I want to talk about today, because it's one thing, right, to, as a third party, call out this is genocide that happened over there and we need to make sure that doesn't happen again. Yes, that's all well and good. But when the nation that's calling it out is in and of itself guilty of committing acts of genocide, or not only of committing genocide, then if it doesn't have the courage to acknowledge its own oppression, its own injustice, then its words have no meaning, right? Its words have no force whatsoever. There's no integrity. And so I want to look very closely at how these categories of what they say genocide is, of how the US committed these atrocities. So the first point, which was killing members of a group. I'm just going to list a few of the massacres here. First of all, we have Andrew Jackson with the Trail of Tears. The Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, 3,000 people died, and many, many thousands were brutally transferred and removed from their land to Oklahoma during the Trail of Tears. And so we have to acknowledge that at least these 3,000 deaths, maybe even more. In 1863, we had the Bear River Massacre, which took place in the area of Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming. In a river in that area, 250 men, women, and children were slaughtered that day. We have the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, where 150 Cheyenne Arapaho men, women, and children were slaughtered. We have the Long Walk of the Navajo and the Mescalero Apache, 1863 to 1868. 2,500 Navajo and Apache people were killed during that period. We have the Baker Massacre, which was the worst massacre that happened in Montana in 1870, with 173 slaughtered there. We have Wounded Knee in South Dakota in 1890, 250 to 300 Dakota men, women, and children slaughtered in a single massacre. Yes, throughout almost the entire 19th century, if you've listened to my talks on the doctrine of discovery, if you've listened to the things that our nation has done, we have been removing Native peoples from land, committing massacres, and ethnically cleansing this continent as we make way for manifest destiny in the Transcontinental Railway. This is historical fact. This is what we were doing. And these things I've listed here are just a few of the atrocities that were committed. And this is just the 19th century. We can go back even further and talk about what other nations did here, not only the US, but other countries did as they claimed the right of discovery over these lands and what happened to those lands. Now, I want to talk just for a moment because I actually did some research this morning on the Bear River Massacre, which happened in 1863. And it was the Shoshone that endured this massacre. And I want to warn, especially my Shoshone relatives who might be listening to this, what I read was horrific. And my heart is broken for what even I just learned happened against your people. I did not know this history, but I'm going to read a few lines from a story in the Smithsonian Magazine, which talks about the Bear River Massacre. And I'm going to share this link in the thread here if you want to read it there. But I'm just going to read this. In the frigid dawn of January 29, 1863, Sagowich, a leader among the Shoshone of Bia or Ogiai, or Big River, in what is now Idaho, stepped outside his lodge and saw a curious band of fog moving down the bluff towards him across a half-frozen river. The mist was no fog, though. It was steam rising in the sub-zero air from hundreds of U.S. Army foot soldiers, cavalry, and their horses. The army was coming for his people. Over the next 4 hours, the 200 soldiers under Colonel Patrick Connor's command killed 250 more Shoshone, including at least 90 women, children, and infants. The Shoshone were shot, stabbed, and battered to death. Some were driven into the icy river to drown or freeze. Historians call the Big River Massacre of 1863 the deadliest reported attack on Native Americans by the U.S. military, worse than Sand Creek in 1864, the Marias in 1870, and Wounded Knee in 1890. It is also the least well known. In 1863, most of the nation's attention was focused on the Civil War, not the distant Western territories. See, what happened here is, as I've said before, this was under the administration, under the policies of President Abraham Lincoln. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act and the Homestead Act, and then within the next 3 years of his presidency, he went through and began systematically, ethnically cleansing the routes of the Transcontinental Railway. The Dakota territories. Now we also have the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado. We have the Navajo, the Long Walk in the New Mexico territory. And now we have this massacre taking place in the area of Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming, where there's a river right there. And that was right in the area where one of the early lines of the Transcontinental Railway was supposed to go. Abraham Lincoln was an absolute war criminal, a very, very, very genocidal man who was ethnically cleansing and committing genocide against Native peoples throughout his entire presidency. So yes, this nation, including Abraham Lincoln, was systematically killing Native peoples as they tried to complete their manifest destiny. The next criteria, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. I want to read something about Fort Sumner, which was where our Navajo people were brought to during the Long Walk. This is actually from D. Brown, who wrote Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and I want to read a section from that book. It was a wretched land, they said. The soldiers prodded them with bayonets and herded them into adobe-walled compounds where the soldier chiefs were always counting them and putting numbers down in little books. The soldier chiefs promised them clothing and blankets and better food, but their promises were never kept. All the cottonwood and mesquite had been cut down so that only roots were left for firewood. To shelter them from the rain or sun, they had to dig holes in the sandy ground and and line them with mats of woven grass. They lived like prairie dogs in burrows. With a few tools the soldiers gave them, they broke the soil of the Pecos bottomlands and planted grain, but floods and droughts and insects killed the crops, and now everyone was on half rations. Crowded together as they were, disease had begun to take a toll on the weaker ones. It was a bad place, and although escape was difficult and dangerous under the watchful eyes of the soldiers, many were risking their lives to get away. They absolutely were intending to cause bodily harm. And this was at Fort Sumner. This was a reservation, technically a death camp that was approved and signed by Abraham Lincoln. Another measure of genocide is imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. I want to read from an article I found at Rochester University. I'll read this for you. In the 1970s, doctors in the United States sterilized an estimated 25 to 42% of Native American women of childbearing age. some as young as 15. Even the lower estimate, 1/4 of Native women, is a whopping statistic. The sterilization subsidized by the federal government and often undertaken without consent or under great duress mark the culmination of a long history of efforts by federal and local authorities to manage the reproductive lives of Native families, explains Brianna Theobald, an assistant professor of history at the University of Rochester, in her book, Reproduction on the Reservation, Pregnancy, Childbirth, and Colonialism in the Long 20th Century. I'm going to share the link to that book in this chat, or not to the book, to that article, so that you can learn more about that yourself. So yes, they were absolutely blocking the reproduction of Native peoples. And then the last is forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The whole purpose of the boarding schools was to kill the Indians to save the man. And Native children were taken from their homes and put into these military-style boarding schools. They were punished for speaking their language. They were punished for practicing their culture. Again, the stories of abuse that happen in these boarding schools, mental, physical, emotional, sexual, is absolutely gut-wrenching. This is genocide. Now, as Turkey has demonstrated, one of the criteria of genocide is you have to establish a deliberate intent. This is why they're denying what happened to the Armenian people was genocide, because they said we did not intend that. This was just a part of the horrors of war. Intent, it says, and this is going back to the UN website, the intent is the most difficult element to determine. To constitute genocide, there must be a proven intent on the part of perpetrators to physically destroy a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. So I want to now turn to two quotes, and I use them frequently in my lectures. The first is by Peter Burnett, who was the first governor of California in 1851 during his State of the State address. And in that address, he said this, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct, must be expected. While we cannot articulate this result or anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or the wisdom of man to avert. Now, he is not saying famine has broken out and we can't feed these people. And he is not saying disease is spreading and we can't stop it. He is literally saying the United States government and white settlers cannot stop killing these people until they become extinct. In 1863, General Carleton, serving under Abraham Lincoln, this is according to the Book of the Navajo by Raymond Friday Locke. This is what he said, not to warriors, but to the Navajo people. Henceforth, every Navajo male is to be killed or taken prisoner on sight. Say to them, go to the Bosque Redondo, or we will pursue you and destroy you. We will not make peace with you on any other terms. This war shall be pursued until you cease to exist or you move. There can be no other talk on the subject. The United States of America absolutely intended to ethnically cleanse Turtle Island as it claimed its self-proclaimed manifest destiny. Intent was absolutely there. This was not just a result. This was what they were intending to do. Peter Burnett observed it. General Carleton ordered it. It happened. Battle after battle, massacre after massacre, settlement after settlement. This was the systematic approach of this government as it moved across this continent, committing genocide against Native peoples. So why will President Biden not call what the U.S. did genocide? Well, you see, his theology won't let him, or his theology won't define it that way. and his politics won't let him. See, the United States of America was founded based on a set of documents written by the Catholic Church between 1452 and 1493, known as the Doctrine of Discovery. It's the church in Europe, saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their land is yours to take. This is why they called it discovery. You cannot discover lands already inhabited unless you don't view the people who are there as human. When the US was claiming manifest destiny in the 1840s, that term was coined. Manifest destiny, the belief that God gave white Europeans the right to rule Turtle Island, this North America, from sea to shining sea. This was the belief. I talk about it in my lectures with the city of John Winthrop's City on a Hill sermon. Even Benjamin Netanyahu acknowledged it when he spoke to a joint session of Congress just a few years ago when he was here in 2015 lobbying against the Iran nuclear deal. And he had a very divided Congress in front of him. And he had to get everyone on the same page. And so early in his remarks, he said to our Congress, because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. The doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, the city on the hill, gives the United States the theological understanding that it is God's chosen people and North America, Turtle Island, is their promised land. And according to Deuteronomy 20, 16 through 17, it says, however, in the cities of the nations, the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivitites, the Jebusites, and as the Lord your God has commanded you. And at the end of that period, in Joshua 10, verse 40, it records, so Joshua subdued the whole region, including the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes, together with all their kings. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. You see, when you claim to have promised lands, according to Old Testament precedent, that gives you the right, the God-ordained right to commit genocide. And so you're allowed. And this is absolutely the theology of the United States of America. This nation that even its own senators and Congress members call Christendom. Christian nationalism, the heresy of Christian empire, which is what excuses them from being guilty of genocide, because they are merely claiming their inheritance of promised lands. So Joe Biden's theology, not only as a practicing Catholic, but also as an American follower of the Christian faith, and as an American, regardless of the faith you practice, the national theology of this country is that the Europeans who came here were sent by God to claim their inheritance as promised lands, which gave them the permission to ethnically cleanse it. This is why Stephen Newcomb, in his book, titled it Pagans in the Promised Land. Because when you have promised land and you find pagans there, what do you do to them? You destroy them. So Joe Biden's theology, as an American, as well as a Catholic, as well as just a Christian, will not allow him to call what happened here genocide. And how do I know this so definitively? Because in 2015, Pope Francis was here. Now, Pope Francis is a hell of a lot more courageous than Joe Biden. And he was speaking to a joint session of our Congress. And he had already used language of apology in Bolivia when speaking to the indigenous peoples there about what happened from the European colonialists. And there was an expectation that he might actually have the courage to hold our government, our Congress, to account. And in his speech, yes, he acknowledged the violence committed against Native peoples. Yes, he acknowledged his respect for Native peoples. But he ended his remarks by saying that, but we are not going to judge the past by the criteria of the present. We are not going to hold ourselves accountable for the atrocities committed based on the present criteria, which actually includes genocide. I wrote an op-ed about it when that happened. And as I said, Pope Francis is a whole lot more courageous than Joe Biden is. And he didn't have the courage to call it genocide and hold this nation to account for the atrocities it had committed. So Joe Biden's not going to do it. A, his theology doesn't even define it as genocide. And B, even the very courageous Pope of the Catholic Church today didn't have the courage to call it genocide. Joe Biden's not going to do it. Second, his politics will never allow him to do it. In the book I wrote, co-authored, On Selling Truth, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the doctrine of discovery, one of the conclusions we bring in this book as we talk about American exceptionalism, the myth of American exceptionalism. So I said American exceptionalism is the coping mechanism for a nation in deep denial of its genocidal past as well as its current racist reality. America has to believe it's exceptional. Because if it's not exceptional, if it doesn't have a special relationship with the God of Abraham, if it doesn't have promised lands, then it is literally just another colonial, genocidal nation that's never been held to account. And that thought is unthinkable to the white landowning men in power. This is why American exceptionalism is one of the most unifying themes in US politics. This is why Donald Trump said, "Make America great again," and Hillary Clinton said, "America's great already." This is why Joe Biden wants to restore the soul of America. This is why President Obama said, "America's already great." If you want to get white landowning men to vote for you and give you money for your campaign, you better know how to tell them how frickin' exceptional they are. The system trains you to do that. And Joe Biden does that very, 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 very well. In fact, during my campaign in 2020, I made the argument that that was his role in the Obama administration, was to help President Obama speak the language of exceptionalism. Remember when Obama first came into office, he went on an apology tour and was immediately ridiculed by members of both the left and the right. You do not go abroad and talk about the injustices of our nation. And by the time he left office, President Obama was absolutely using the language of American exceptionalism, almost to the point it was nauseating to listen to him. I'm fairly convinced that was one of Joe Biden's jobs, one of his roles. He was a white male. He had to make President Obama safe to white landowning men. And I think he did it very well. Joe Biden did not get elected by appealing to people of color. He got elected by appealing to white moderates from both the left and the right. That's what got him elected. He raised $1 billion through his own campaign committee. This isn't even talking about the hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of dollars that was spent through PAC and other dark political money. The Lincoln Project, right? They supported him. Republicans supported him. Why? He was a white landowning male who absolutely committed and promised to maintaining the status quo. Joe Biden got elected by white landowning men from the 1%. Trust me, he is not going to turn around and tell those same people they committed genocide. And how do I know this so definitively? Because in 2009, a bill came to the White House. It was House Resolution 3326, the 2010 Department of Defense Appropriations Act, subsection 8113, page 67 of this 70-plus page bill, was titled Apology to Native Peoples of the United States. And what was included was this very, very watered down version of U.S. history. Ill-conceived policies, a few things that use that type of language. Didn't hold us to account in any way, shape, or form. Mentioned no specific tribe, no specific treaty, no specific injustice. Says you had some nice land, our citizens didn't take it very politely. Let's now just call it all of our land and we'll steward it together. And then it ends with a disclaimer saying nothing in here is legally binding. And the Obama administration, which Joe Biden loves to point out he was an integral part of, buried it. Never mentioned it. I sent a letter personally to the White House asking for President Obama or someone from there to represent them when I hosted a public reading of that apology in front of the Capitol building on December 19, 2012. And I got a letter back from the White House that neither President Obama nor anyone from his administration would be at my event. This past year, 2020, we had 2 Native forums. Historic Native forums where candidates, top-tier candidates, came and spoke directly to Native peoples. Bernie Sanders showed up, Elizabeth Warren showed up, Julian Castro showed up, Kamala Harris showed up. I was there. Joe Biden never showed up. They asked questions about the Remove the Stain Act and the medals of honor given to U.S. soldiers who participated in the massacre at Wounded Knee. Joe Biden wasn't there to answer that question. He doesn't have the courage. His politics will not allow him to admit that his nation committed genocide against Native peoples. His church won't define it as genocide. The national theology of the nation won't hold him accountable for genocide. And his politics will not allow him to admit it was genocide. I've debated, should I try to protest or rally to try to get Joe Biden to acknowledge this, but no, it would be a waste of time. So this is These are my thoughts on this. You can tell this is deeply emotional for me. This is why I ran in 2020. This is why I ran. Because I wanted our nation to create this type of a common memory. I want our nation to be honest about who we are and what we've done and what we need to change to get where we want to go. This is why my first 100-day plan was to remove the racism, the sexism, and white supremacy from our foundations. This is why my goal was to decenter white landowning men. And instead, we absolutely centered them again. So we'll call out injustices around the globe. We'll call what Turkey did to Armenia genocide. We'll hold China accountable for human rights abuses. But we won't take a hard look at ourselves, at what we did and the things that we enacted in order to become who we are as a nation. And so our cries for justice around the world ring hollow. They ring very, very, very hollow. And that's deeply disappointing. And I have very little hope that Joe Biden is going to change that. He'll be nicer than Donald Trump was. He'll act with a bit more compassion. He'll seem a bit more concerned, but he's not going to change anything. He's not going to change anything. So these are my thoughts today, my relatives. I know I got a little emotional. Actually, it was part of what got me going was reading about the genocide, the Bear River massacre, which I hadn't studied that one before, and reading about it this morning and seeing how that was just another thing that Abraham Lincoln did. The man was an absolute war criminal. And the fact that we honor him makes me want to vomit. But these are the things we have to wrestle with, right? We need to continue to press forward. We need to create common memory. We need to remove racism, sexism, white supremacy from our foundations. We need a national dialogue on race, gender, and class, a conversation I would put on par with the Truth and the Reconciliation Commission that happened in South Africa, Rwanda, and Canada. But I would call ours Truth and Conciliation, because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony. We can do better. We can. I have absolute hope that we can. But we have to stop centering white landowning men from the 1%. We have to stop believing a white male is going to somehow save this country. We need to gain courage. We need to step out of the white supremacist worldview that all of us have been put into. And we need to believe the world can exist even if white landowning men aren't at the center of it. I'm not calling for oppression or mistreatment of white people. I'm saying we have to decenter whiteness so that we can all be peers. This is why I tweet at times, white people aren't superior. That's not a racist term. That's just stating fact, because so much of what we're fed day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year is that white people are in the center and they're superior. And they're not. If Black Lives Matter, white people are not superior. We should be able to say them both without flinching or feeling awkward. Why? Because so much of what we're told is that Black lives, Native lives, people of color's lives don't matter. And so much of what we're told is that white people are superior, right? They have white privilege. They don't have privilege. They have the fruits of oppression. And that's not privilege. So we need to do better, my relatives. This is why I go out in the mornings and watch the sunrise. We need to do better. We need to walk in beauty. My relatives, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate you being on this live stream with me. I'll be talking more this week. I hope to watch the sunrise again tomorrow morning. If you want to get a copy of my book, let me put a link to that in the chat. You can get it on my website, Unsettling Truth. My relatives, and Hakonet. Walk in beauty, and may we learn how to walk in beauty together.